Jeffrey Dahmer, The Milwaukee Cannibal, by Ava Rybarczyk. Dahmer was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to Lionel and Joyce, and at the age of 6, they moved to Ohio, but didn't settle down until he was 8 in Bath, Ohio. While he was growing up, he was in 4 H and raised animals with his father to show. He also engaged in other activities during this that help children learn by doing experiences and preparing them for life. From there, he attended schooling all throughout high school, and at the age of 18, his parents got divorced. His parents were quite absent throughout his life. His dad was always preoccupied with his work and was never home. His mother, on the other hand, was home, but she suffered with many mental problems, such as depression, and even tried to commit suicide. This played a huge role in Dahmer's life, not only growing up, but when they got divorced, and was one of the reasons why he had many mental problems. After high school, Dahmer attended the Ohio State University, but only stayed for one semester and dropped out due to his drinking problems. He ended the semester with a .45 GPA on a 4-point scale due to failure of all of his courses except one. His father was not pleased with these decisions, so he made him enlist in the army. Once enlisted, he was trained in Texas and then sent to Germany, but was soon discharged due to his alcoholism. 2 fellow soldiers claimed to be raped by him. After he arrived home, he had many run ins with the police due to his drinking, being a bad kid, and getting into trouble a lot. So his dad sent him back to Wisconsin to live with his grandma. Dahmer killed a total of 17 males, and mostly all of them were African American, while all of them were homosexual. He would visit bars and clubs to find the men he wanted to kill, and these crimes took place over the years 1978 to 1991. His first killing was in the year of 1978, and his victim's name was Stephen Hicks. However, he waited almost a decade for his next killing. His victims. Stephen Hicks, his first victim, was killed at his Ohio home. Hicks was just a hitchhiker trying to get somewhere, and Dahmer was more than willing to take him. He took him home to his house, beat him with a barbell, strangled him, and then proceeded to dismember his body. He then buried him in the backyard where he couldn't be found. Later in his life, he returned back to Ohio, dug up Hicks's body, and smashed his bones into tiny little pieces with a sledgehammer. He spun in a circle and sprinkled his remains to make it that much harder to find, and more importantly, identify the parts and who they belonged to. Another one of his victims, Ernest Miller, was drugged and then murdered. Dahmer slashed his neck open, which led to his death by bleeding out. He then removed Miller's flesh from his bones, bleached his skeleton, put his parts in the freezer to be consumed at a later time, and his skull was kept to be painted and later be put on display. Matt Turner fell into the same unfortunate luck as these two. Dahmer found him at a gay pride parade, and Turner went home with him. He unfortunately was drugged, strangled, dismembered, and then thrown into a blue barrel with acid. Oliver Lacey and Dahmer worked together at the chocolate factory and would hang out often, engaging in sexual activities. However, just like the others, he was soon drugged and strangled. But this time, Dahmer used his body as a sex toy before he dismembered him. Lacey was one of the victims that Dahmer ate, and his heart was kept in the fridge to be consumed. Stephen Tuomi was just another man that fell to the unfortunate terms that came along with Dahmer. Him and Dahmer spent a night out at the bar together and headed back to a hotel where Dahmer later slipped him sedatives and abused him. The next morning, he woke up and found Tuomi dead, but he does not remember killing him or any of the events of the night prior. He then stuffed his body into a suitcase and left. When he arrived at his grandma's house, he used his body for necrophilia and later dismembered and disposed of it. His head was the only thing he kept to be used for more sexual acts. James Doxeter, his next victim, was a 14-year-old male prostitute. They met outside of a local gay bar and went back to Dahmer's grandmother's house, where he was strangled him and disposed of his body, except for his head, and used it for the same acts as he did with Tuomi. Richard Guerrero, another victim, he met at a nightclub and went home with Dahmer, engaged in oral sex, and once again was drugged and strangled. Guerrero was just another victim that Dahmer performed necrophilia on before disposing of his body. Jeremiah Weinberger also met Dahmer at a nightclub and went home with him, spent the night. However, the next morning when he got up and tried to leave, Dahmer became angry with him and attacked him. He injected hot water into his head and used it to create what he called a living zombie. He wanted to have total control over his victims. He later disposed of his body in acid. Continuing on with Dahmer's victims, his next one was Anthony Sears. Following the common theme, they met at a gay bar, and he used money to lure him back to his home. They engaged in consensual sex before he drugged and strangled him. As with many other victims, he kept the head of this man. However, he boiled it this time to remove the skin, painted the skull, and kept it as a souvenir along with the man's genitals. Dahmer was sentenced to serve 8 years in prison for a 13-year-old that escaped him. However, he only served 10 months before being released, and this is when he moved to his apartment after. When he was released from prison, he met Edward Smith at a bar, and they went back to his apartment, where he was drugged and strangled, and then put into acid. Raymond Smith was killed only a few weeks after Edward Smith, and like the others, he was drugged, strangled, and dismembered. He kept his skull and got rid of his remains. The rest of his victims included David Thomas, Curtis Straughter, Errol Lindsay, Anthony Hughes, Conorak Sinsamphone, and Joseph Braidhoff. Sparing the details of all of these men, they were killed in the same fashion, such as being strangled, dismembered, and the body parts being kept and discarded of. Dahmer followed a specific pattern which is seen throughout all of his victims' murders. Mentioned on the previous slide, Dahmer was not a normal killer who went around murdering and then burying the victim. He would go to the lengths of keeping his victims' body parts, consuming the flesh of his victims so they could always be a part of him, painting their skulls, and bleaching some of their skeletons. He did this to fulfill all the fantasies he had and to ultimately stay close to him. This was the case in almost every single one of his killings, and the parts he kept served as mementos to the men he knew, but shortly after were killed. His confessions of his murders were nothing short. They took over 60 hours to finish, and later, when he got towards the end, he got very comfortable with the police and would occasionally look up at them and smile. Story after story that he told them got worse by the second, and none of them could compare to other murders that the police had encountered. Dahmer was deemed sane at the time of his murders by both the jury and the judge, and was sentenced to 957 years in prison, which is equivalent to 15 life sentences. He was put in the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin, and his parents came to visit him once a month. Dahmer came off as an innocent man who was just another average Joe. However, that was far from the truth. His ability to switch from a nice guy to a monster was like the flip of a switch. Since he was a child, he had both sadistic and sexual fantasies, which led into both his killings and what he did to his victims both before and after he murdered them. As an adult, Dahmer lived in Milwaukee in the Oxford Apartments, and his was number 213. The apartments were located on the west side of Milwaukee, and the building had 49 units in which other residents lived in. Many people were very suspicious of the behaviors that went on behind his door. Tenants complained about foul odors and the sounds of struggle, but due to the way that Dahmer presented himself and carried himself in public, no one did or said anything about it. And when they did, the police would ignore it and brush it off as it was nothing. Once Dahmer was in prison, Reverend Roy Ratliff would visit him weekly and introduced him to God. Finding God made Dahmer change his mind about his planned suicide, and he had looked forward to changing and living the life God had given him. However, these plans were cut short. Due to being in such high security for the crimes that he committed and the sentence he was given, he wasn't able to see a lot of inmates of the prison population. He requested seeing more people, and that wish was granted when he was given a janitorial job in a 3-person crew. On Monday morning, when he started his job at 7:50 a.m., him and his crewmates started to work. At 8:10, Dahmer and his fellow crewmate were found bludgeoned, the murder weapon a broomstick. The other crewmate was the one who murdered them, however, he was not charged for the murders. Dahmer's life came to a quick end, and he was only 34 at the time of his death. He had only been in prison for less than 3 years when he was killed. Overall, Dahmer killed many innocent men in his life, but wasn't able to do the time he deserved for it.